Chapter 5. A Bowl of Milk. Every day, Savasti went into the forest to visit Siddhartha. When he was able to cut 2 bundles of grass by midday, he had lunch with Siddhartha. But as the dry season continued and fresh grass became more and more scarce, it was often late afternoon before he could visit his friend and teacher. Sometimes, when Savasti arrived, Siddhartha was sitting in meditation, and the boy sat silently for a brief moment and then left the forest, not wanting to disturb his teacher's meditation. But when he found Siddhartha walking slowly along the forest path, he joined him, sometimes sharing simple conversation. Savasti also met Sujata frequently in the forest. Every day, she bought Siddhartha a rice ball with 1 condiment, such as sesame salt, peanuts, or a bit of curry. She also bought him milk, or rice porridge, or rock candy. The children had many occasions to talk with each other at the edge of the forest while the buffalo grazed. Sometimes Sujata brought her friend Supriya, a young girl Savasti's age. Savasti wanted to bring his brother and sisters to meet Siddhartha. He was sure they could cross the river at its most shallow point without difficulty. Sujata told Savasti how she first met Siddhartha several months earlier and how she had since brought him food every day around noon. It was on a full moon day. At her mother's request, she had put on a new pink sari and carried a platter of food to offer to the forest gods. There were cakes, milk, congee, and honey. The noon sun blazed. As Sujata neared the river, she saw a man lying unconscious on the road. She put down her platter and ran to him. He was barely breathing and his eyes were tightly closed. His cheeks had the sunken look of someone who had not had food for a long time. From his long hair, tangled beard, and ragged garment, Sujata knew he was a mountain ascetic who must have fainted from hunger. Without hesitating, she poured a cup of milk and eased it against the man's lips, spilling a few drops onto them. At first he did not respond, but then his lips quivered and parted slightly. Sujata slowly poured milk into his mouth. He began to drink, and before long the cup was empty. Sujata then sat along the river bank to see if the man would regain consciousness. Slowly he sat up and opened his eyes. Seeing Sujata, he smiled. He pulled the end of his garment back up over his shoulder and folded his legs in a lotus position. He began to breathe, first shallowly and then more deeply. His sitting was stable and beautiful. Thinking that he must be a mountain god, Sujata joined her palms and began to prostrate herself before him. But the man motioned for her to stop. Sujata sat up, and the man spoke to her in a soft voice. "Child, please pour me a little more milk." Happy to hear him speak, Sujata poured another cup, and he drank it all. He felt how truly nourishing it was. Less than an hour before, he thought he was about to breathe his last. Now his eyes shone, and he smiled gently. Sujata asked him how he had fainted on the road. "I have been practicing meditation in the mountains. Harsh ascetic discipline has left my body weak. So today I decided to walk down to the village to beg for some food. but I lost all my strength getting here. Thanks to you, my life has been saved." They sat along the riverbank together, and the man told Sujata about himself. He was Siddhartha, the son of a king who reigned over the country of the Sakya clan. Sujata listened carefully as Siddhartha told her, "I have seen that abusing the body cannot help one to find peace or understanding. The body is not just an instrument. It is the temple of the spirit, the raft by which we cross to the other shore. I will no longer practice self-mortification. I will go into the village each morning to beg for food." Sujata joined her palms. "Honourable hermit, if you allow me, I will bring you food each day. There is no need for you to interrupt your meditation practice. My home is not far from here, and I know my parents would be happy for me to bring you your meal." Siddhartha was silent for a moment. Then he answered, "I am glad to accept your offer, but from time to time, I would also like to go into the village to beg in order to meet the villagers. I would like to meet your parents and other children in the village as well." Sujata was very happy. She joined her palms and bowed in gratitude. The thought of Siddhartha visiting her home and meeting her parents was wonderful. She knew too that bringing him food every day would be no hardship, as her family was one of the wealthiest in the village. She did not mention this to Siddhartha. She only understood that this monk was important and that offering food to him was more beneficial than making a dozen offerings to the forest gods. If Siddhartha's meditation deepened, she felt, this love and understanding could help relieve much suffering in the world. Siddhartha pointed out the Dangsiri mountain where he had lived in the caves. "Beginning today, I will not return there. This forest is cool and refreshing. There is a magnificent pipala tree, which I shall make the place of my practice. Tomorrow, when you come with the food offering, please bring it there. Come, I will show you the spot." Siddhartha led Sujata across the river into the cool forest that bordered the other bank of the Naranjara River. He showed her the pipala tree under which he would meditate. Sujata admired its massive trunk and raised her head to gaze at the leafy branches which spread out like an enormous canopy. It was a kind of banyan tree with leaves shaped like hearts with long pointed tails. The leaves were as big as Siddhartha's hand. She listened to the birds chirping happily among the branches. It was a truly peaceful and refreshing spot. In fact, she had been to this tree before with her parents to make food offerings to the forest gods. "This is your new home, teacher." Sujata looked at Siddhartha with her round black eyes. "I will visit you here every day." Siddhartha nodded. He walked Sujata back out of the forest and said goodbye to her at the riverbank. Then he returned alone to the pipala tree. From that day on, Sujata brought rice or chapatis to offer to the monk, just before the sun began to cast shadows. Sometimes she also brought milk or congee. Once in a while, Siddhartha would carry his begging bowl into the village. He met Sujata's father, the village chief, and her mother, who was wearing a beautiful yellow sari. Sujata introduced him to other children in the village and took him to the barber so he could have his head and beard shaved. Siddhartha's health recovered rapidly, and he told Sujata that his meditation practice was beginning to bear fruit. Then came the day that Sujata met Svasti. That day, Sujata had come early. She listened as Siddhartha told her about meeting Savasti the day before. She had just said that she wished to meet Savasti herself when he appeared. Afterward, whenever she met Savasti, she never forgot to ask about his family. She and her servant Purna even went to Savasti's hut. Purna was hired to work in Sujata's household when her predecessor, Radha, had died of typhoid fever. On these visits, Siddhartha bought used clothes, still full of good wear, for Savasti's family to use. And much to Purna's surprise, Sujata lifted baby Bhima into her arms. Afterwards, she cautioned Purna not to tell her parents that she had held an untouchable child. One day, a number of children decided to go and visit Siddhartha together. All of Savasti's family came. Sujata brought her girlfriends, Balagupta, Vijayasena, Uluvilika, and Jatilika. She also invited her 16-year-old cousin, Nandabala, who brought her younger brothers, Nalaka, who was 14, and Subhash, who was 9. 11 children sat in a semicircle around Siddhartha, and they ate lunch together in silence. Savasti had instructed Bala and Rupak beforehand how to eat with quiet dignity. Even baby Bhima, sitting on Savasti's lap, ate without making a sound, her eyes open wide. Savasti bought a new armful of fresh grass for Siddhartha. He had asked his friend Gavampati, also a buffalo boy, to watch over Mr. Rumble's buffaloes so that he could have lunch with Siddhartha. In the fields the sun blazed, but within the forest, Siddhartha and the children were refreshed by the cool shade of the pipala tree. Its leafy branches extended over an area wider than a dozen houses. The children shared their food with one another, and Rupak and Bala especially enjoyed chapati with curry and fragrant white rice dipped in peanuts and sesame salt. Sujata and Balagupta brought enough water for everyone to drink. Savasti's heart overflowed with happiness. The atmosphere was still and quiet, yet alive with the greatest joy. On that day, at Sujata's request, Siddhartha told them the story of his life. The children listened enraptured, from beginning to end. Chapter 6. Beneath a Rose Apple Tree. When he was 9 years old, Siddhartha was told about the dream his mother had before giving birth to him. A magnificent white elephant with 6 tusks descended from the heavens, surrounded by a chorus of beatific praises. The elephant approached her, its skin white as mountain snow. It held a brilliant pink lotus flower in its trunk and placed the flower within the queen's body. Then the elephant too entered her effortlessly, and all at once she was filled with deep ease and joy. She had the feeling she would never again know any suffering, worry, or pain, and she awoke uplifted by a sensation of pure bliss. When she got up from her bed, the ethereal music from the dream still echoed in her ears. She told her husband the king of the dream, and he too marvelled at it. That morning, the king summoned all the holy men in the capital to come and divine the meaning of the queen's dream. After listening intently to the dream's content, they responded, "Your Majesty, the queen will give birth to a son who will be a great leader. He is destined to become either a mighty emperor who rules throughout the four directions, or a great teacher who will show the way of truth to all beings in heaven and earth. Our land, Your Majesty, has long awaited the appearance of such a great one. King Suddhodana beamed. After consulting the Queen, he ordered that provisions from the royal storehouses be distributed to the ill and unfortunate throughout the land. Thus, the citizens of the kingdom of Sakya shared the king and queen's joy over the news of their future son. Siddhartha's mother was named Mahamaya, a woman of great virtue. Her love extended to all beings, people, animals, and plants. It was the custom in those days for a woman to return to her parents' home to give birth there. Mahamaya was from the country of Kolya, so she set out for Ramagama, the capital of Kolya. Along the way, she stopped to rest in the garden of Lumbini. The forest there was filled with flowers and singing birds. Peacocks fanned their splendid tails in the morning light. Admiring an ashok tree in full bloom, the queen walked towards it, when suddenly, feeling unsteady, she grabbed a branch of the ashok tree to support herself. Just a moment later, still holding the branch, Queen Mahamaya gave birth to a radiant son. The prince was bathed in fresh water and wrapped in yellow silk by Mahamaya's attendants. As there was no longer any need to return to Ramagama, the queen and the newborn prince were carried home in their four-horse carriage. When they arrived home, the prince was again bathed in warm water and placed next to his mother. Hearing the news, King Suddhodana hurried in to see his wife and son. His joy was boundless, his eyes sparkled, and he named the prince Siddhartha, the one who accomplishes his aim. Everyone in the palace rejoiced, and one by one they came to offer their congratulations to the queen. King Suddhodana wasted no time in summoning the soothsayers to tell him of Siddhartha's future. After examining the baby's features, they all agreed that the boy bore the marks of a great leader and would no doubt rule over a mighty kingdom that spread out in all four directions. 1 week later, a holy man named Asita Kaladeva paid a visit to the palace. His back was bent with age, and he needed a cane to descend the mountain where he lived. When the palace guards announced Master Asita's arrival, King Suddhodana personally came out to greet him. He ushered him in to see the baby prince. The holy man gazed at the prince for a long time without uttering a word. Then he began to weep, his trembling body supported by his cane. Streams of tears fell from his eyes. King Suddhodana grew alarmed and asked, "What is it? Do you forebode some misfortune for the child?" Master Asita wiped the tears with his hands and shook his head. "Your Majesty, I see no misfortune at all. I weep for myself, for I can clearly see that this child possesses true greatness. He will penetrate all the mysteries of the universe. Your Majesty, your son will not be a politician. He will be a great master of the way. Heaven and earth will be his home, and all beings his relations. I weep because I will pass away before I have a chance to hear his voice proclaim the truths that he will realize. Majesty, You and your country possess great merit to have given birth to such a one as this boy." Asita turned to leave. The king pleaded for him to stay, but it was of no use. The old man began walking back to his mountain. Master Asita's visit sent the king into a frenzy. He did not want his son to become a monk. He wanted him to assume his throne and extend the borders of their kingdom. The king thought, Asita is only one among hundreds, even thousands of holy men. Perhaps his prophecy is mistaken. Surely the other holy men who said Siddhartha would become a great emperor were correct. Clinging to this hope, the king was comforted. After having attained sublime joy, giving birth to Siddhartha, Queen Mahamaya died 8 days later, and all the kingdom mourned her. King Suddhodana summoned her sister, Mahapajapati, and asked her to become the new queen. Mahapajapati, also known as Gautami, agreed, and she cared for Siddhartha as if he were her own son. As the boy grew older and asked about his real mother, he understood how much Gautami had loved her sister, and how she, more than anyone else in the world, could love him as much as his own mother. Under Gautami's care, Siddhartha grew strong and healthy. One day, as Gautami watched Siddhartha play in the garden, she realized he was old enough to learn the graces of wearing gold and precious gems. She instructed her attendants to bring forth precious jewels to try on Siddhartha, but to her surprise, none rendered Siddhartha more handsome than he already was. As Siddhartha expressed discomfort wearing such things, Gautami ordered that the jewels be returned to their cases. When Siddhartha reached school age, he studied literature, writing, music, and athletics with the other princes of the Sakya dynasty. Among his schoolmates were his cousins Devadatta and Kimbila, and the son of a palace dignitary, a boy named Kaludai. Naturally intelligent, Siddhartha mastered his lessons quickly. His teacher, Visvamitra, found the young Devadatta a sharp student, but never in his teaching career had he taught a student more impressive than Siddhartha. One day, when he was 9 years old, Siddhartha and his schoolmates were allowed to attend the ritual first ploughing of the fields. Gautami dressed Siddhartha right down to the fine slippers on his feet. Attired in his royal best, King Suddhodana presided over the ceremonies. High-ranking holy men and Brahmins paraded in robes and headdresses of every colour imaginable. The ceremony was held next to the finest fields in the kingdom, not far from the palace itself. Flags and banners waved from every gate and along every roadside. Colourful displays of food and drink were laid out on altars crowding along the roads. Minstrels and musicians strolled among the throngs of people, adding mirth and merriment to the bustling festivities. Holy men chanted with utmost solemnity as Siddhartha's father and all the dignitaries of the court stood facing the unfolding ritual. Siddhartha stood towards the back with Devadatta and Kaludai at his sides. The boys were excited because they had been told that when the rituals were over, everyone would enjoy a feast spread out on the grassy meadow. Siddhartha did not often go on picnics, and he was delighted. But the holy men's chanting went on and on, what seemed like forever, and the young boys grew restless. Unable to endure any longer, they wandered off. Kaludai, held onto Siddhartha's sleeve, and off they went in the direction of the music and dancing. The hot sun blazed, and the performers' costumes grew wet with perspiration. Beads of sweat shone on the dancing girls' foreheads. After running about among the scenes of entertainment, Siddhartha too grew hot, and he left his friends to seek the shade of the rose-apple tree alongside the road. Beneath the cool branches, Siddhartha felt pleasantly refreshed. At that moment, Gautami appeared, and spotting her son, she said, "I've been looking all over for you. Where have you been? You should return now for the conclusion of the ceremony. It would please your father." "Mother, the ceremony is too long. Why must the holy men chant so long?" "They are reciting the Vedas, my child. The scriptures have a profound meaning, handed down by the Creator himself to the Brahmins countless generations ago. You will study them soon." "Why doesn't father recite the scriptures instead of having the Brahmins do it?" "Only those born into the Brahmana caste are permitted to recite the scriptures, my child. Even kings who wield great power must depend on the services of the Brahmins for priestly duties." Siddhartha thought over Gautami's words. After a long pause, he joined his palms and entreated her. "Please, mother, ask father if I may stay here. I feel so happy sitting beneath this rose-apple tree." Giving in good-naturedly to her child, Gautami smiled and nodded. She stroked his hair and then returned down the path. At last the Brahmins concluded their prayers. King Suddhodana stepped down into the fields and together with 2 military officers began to plough the first row of the season as cheers resounded among the crowd. Then the farmers followed the king's example and began to plough their fields. Hearing the people's cheers, Siddhartha ran to the edge of the fields. He watched a water buffalo straining to pull a heavy plough, followed by a robust farmer whose skin was bronzed from long work in the sun. The farmer's left hand steadied the plough, while his right hand wielded a whip to urge the buffalo on. Sun blazed, and the man's sweat poured in streams from his body. The rich earth was divided into 2 neat furrows. As the plough turned the earth, Siddhartha noticed that the bodies of worms and other small creatures were being cut as well. As the worms writhed upon the ground, they were spotted by birds who flew down and grabbed them in their beaks. Then Siddhartha saw a large bird swoop down and grasp a small bird in its talons. Utterly absorbed in these events, standing beneath the burning sun, Siddhartha too became drenched in sweat. He ran back to the shade of the rose-apple tree. He had just witnessed so many things, strange and unknown to him. He sat cross-legged and closed his eyes to reflect on all he had seen. Composed and erect, he sat for a long time, oblivious to all the singing, the dancing and picnicking taking place around him. Siddhartha continued to sit, absorbed by the images of the field and the many creatures. When the king and queen passed by, some time later, they discovered Siddhartha still sitting in deep concentration. Gautami was moved to tears, seeing how beautiful Siddhartha looked, like a small, still statue. But King Suddhodana was seized with sudden apprehension. If Siddhartha could sit so solemnly at such a young age, might not the holy man Asita's prophecy come true? Too disturbed to remain for the picnic, the king returned alone to the palace in his royal carriage. Some poor country children passed by the tree, speaking and laughing happily. Gautami motioned them to be quiet. She pointed to Siddhartha sitting beneath the rose apple tree. Curious, the children stared at him. Suddenly Siddhartha opened his eyes. Seeing the queen, he smiled. "Mother," he said, "reciting the scriptures does nothing to help the worms and the birds." Siddhartha stood up and ran to Gautami and clasped her hand. He then noticed the children observing him. They were about his own age, but their clothes were tattered, their faces soiled, and their arms and legs piteously thin. Aware of his princely attire, Siddhartha felt embarrassed, and yet he wanted very much to play with them. He smiled and hesitantly waved, and one boy smiled back. That was all the encouragement Siddhartha needed. He asked Gautami for permission to invite the children to the picnic feast. At first she hesitated, but then she nodded in assent. Dear friends, this is where we pause our story. Go gently and good night.